Today we're going to discuss engine management. This discussion is primarily for Cirrus owners and Cirrus clients of ours. And Chris, tell me a little bit why we may be using engine management as a subject for today. We got all these subjects we could talk about, and engine management was one of the first ones that we discussed. We need really to get out there to help our clients and to help Cirrus owners, because there's a lot of techniques out there that might or may not be good for running their engines that can cause issues over time. So talk a little bit about why we are using this as our discussion for today.
Thanks, Anthony. We see a lot of aircraft come through the service center of PRP Aviation that has various issues, specifically inside the cylinders. And some of these issues can be attributed to running the engine at too high of a power setting or too low of a power setting. We also see a lot of our clients who were either not taught properly or have forgotten many of the limitations that exist within the POH, specifically Section 2 and Section 4 for normal operations on the proper management of their power plant in climb, cruise, and descent profiles. Layer that with all the information that exists on the web and personal opinion and various techniques and the evolution of technology. You look at a lot of our students, they've never driven a car whose engine was not controlled by a computer.
Right. Okay.
And when we really peel back the layers of the onion of what that computer is doing for us, it's either advancing or retarding the timing to optimize ignition based on the density altitude that the car is sensing. Take, for example, climbing from Colorado Springs to the top of Pikes Peak. The fuel-air mixture is extremely different at the top of Pikes Peak than down in Colorado Springs.
Correct. My dad's station wagon almost didn't make it to the top back when I was 14. I get that.
My dad's Oldsmobile Buick did not make it to the top when I was 15. It was a good old carbureted engine, and it died about a half mile from the top of the mountain.
Could you just hike the rest of the way up?
We did. We had to go. We had to go get the donuts at the top.
Family adventure.
But in today's modern car, there's an electronic control module, FADAC, who knows what we want to call it. Bottom line, there's a computer that is controlling ignition, fuel-air mixture, and with the case of our cars, it's also controlling all of these issues to optimize the pollutants that are coming out of the vehicle. Our power plants and our Cirruses are based on technology that was designed in the 1930s, 40s, and early 50s. The benefit today is manufacturing quality has gone up significantly, but we're still dealing with dated technology.
Okay.
So we, the pilot, it is our job to properly set up the fuel-air mixture, right, to optimize performance based on, are we climbing, are we cruising, are we descending, right, in an environment where, right, the air density is changing by the minute.
Now, the Cirrus has made it easier for us because they've connected the throttle with the propeller governor to be able to control both the prop and the throttle at the same lever. But there's still techniques that we can use to help simplify and save engines in the Cirrus.
So Cirrus's choice to connect those two cables coming from the engine compared to a Bonanza Cessna 206, where we look in the cockpit and there are three levers, one for the throttle, one for the RPM control, and the third for the mixture. Our Continental IO 550 or the IO 390 and the SR-20, those engines don't know that they're inside of a Cirrus. Okay. They still have three cables,
right,
connected to either, right, the throttle body, the fuel control for the mixture, or the prop governor. And Cirrus, combining two of them into one lever, we also see that we may or may not have really learned how to optimize how the mechanism is truly working. Because those of us who fly Cirruses know that there's a whole bunch of power change in the bottom, about 1 inch of travel of the throttle. Yes. There's a lot of power change at the top 1 inch, and in the middle, we're doing a lot of throttle movement for not very much power change.
That's right. It's a little bit to get used to for someone who's used to more linear of a throttle response, and it's a really, not quite a dead zone, but a very less responsive zone in the middle.
So let's talk about why that is. If you look in the POH section 5, all right, and you're looking to figure out what prop setting, what temperature, what fuel flow to pick for a certain power setting at cruise, the predominant RPM of the propeller for all of the Cirrus aircraft, 2,500 RPM. As a reminder, a propeller is an airfoil, which means there's an optimized angle of attack for that blade that minimizes slippage. And that's one of the benefits of a constant speed propeller. So when you look at where the RPM setting is towards that middle section where we don't see much power change as we're moving the throttle in the Cirrus, the prop is about 2,500 RPM.
Okay.
So today we're going to probably come back to this little saying that we hear. In aviation, we love to measure with the micrometer, mark it with a crayon, and split it with a chainsaw.
Yeah.
Especially with digital avionics, where we've got all these digital gauges. We pilots, we love, right? I am going to fly at 74.9%.
That's right.
74.8 and 75 are right out. 74.9. No, in all seriousness, a lot of times with aviation, when it comes to aircraft, I don't care if it's a propeller with a piston, a turboprop, or a jet. Aerodynamics is still probably one of the most analog things we're ever going to do when we look at controlling the four forces that are acting upon an aircraft, especially one of which being drag, right, as we're flying the aircraft in various situations. So, you know, when we're thinking about managing our power plant, right, so first off is how the throttle is mechanized, all right, with the Cirrus. So let's first start off with a couple of procedures that are buried in the COA or the POH. First off, when we climb the Cirrus, the throttle is full forward.
Right.
We are at high RPM, either 2,700 RPM or the SR-20, the SR-22 normally aspirated, or 2,500 RPM for the SR-22T.
Okay.
Right. We see a lot of clientele who come from different platforms who like to slow the propeller down when they're 800,000 feet above the ground. Proper procedure is throttle full forward.
Okay.
The main aerodynamic reason behind this is the propeller needs to be at a lower angle of attack, which means a higher RPM, because we're climbing at a slower airspeed than we fly at cruise. So Cirrus, when they combined the throttle cable and the prop governor into one lever, the other lever they give us is the mixture. So we're using mixture to actually control, all right, the power that the engine is producing for a given RPM.
Right. Makes sense.
So our goal today is to not have conversations about various opinions on lean of peak, rich of peak, right? Our premise is if Cirrus, Continental, and Lycoming have published a procedure in the POH, the really smart people that designed these aircraft and these power plants, they've given us the proper procedures to run these engines.
Correct.
We are here to share techniques that we've developed and utilized with our experience in the aircraft that have, in a case of one of our aircraft, we went 2,000 hours on the power plant. We never changed a cylinder.
Right.
The airplane would have, or that engine, we probably would have kept flying it if it weren't for the fact that it's on a 135 certificate.
Correct.
And by law, we had to do an engine swap. So we're here to talk about how to take the POH and Cirrus recommendations and Continental and Lycoming recommendations and limitations and put it into practical use.
I like it. So the rest of the podcast, we'll talk about 3 different engine types that we have on the Cirruses that we currently fly here. And if we have time, we may go into some Gen 1, Gen 2. But for now, we'll talk about Gen 3 and above aircraft for the Cirrus. And if you're not a Cirrus owner, some of these techniques might apply, might not. Please consult your manufacturer and your POH But for the Cirrus, we found that these, again, are techniques that have worked for us at PRP to create engine longevity and to get good inspections. So we'll first talk about the SR-20 and the IO-390, the Lycoming IO-390. And we're going to kind of walk through ground ops all the way up, just to kind of the few little minor techniques here and there, the boost pump on and off, how to start it, how to manage it in the climb, the cruise, and the descent phase to include coming back, all the way for each one of these type of engines. And we're going to start off with the SR-20. We got a couple of training aircraft, SR-20s. We've flown for a few years now. They've been doing great, and we've got, we think, our solidified techniques for how we run and how we have our renters and our students and clients run these aircraft when they either rent them or we instruct them. Starting off with the IO-390, the Lycoming, we'll just start off with the starting procedures. And so for those watching on YouTube, I'll have a little start card procedures that we've created for PRP Aviation and our clients. We have these in each of our aircraft. And I will put a link. There's actually a link to this on our website, prpaviation.com. You can go to and find that under our training tab. I've just posted that this morning. So that's there for us to kind of use as we go through this checklist of how to start the engine. We also, on the back side of that, we have our leaning procedures, which we'll go through as well for each of the types we just talked about, each of those three engines. So starting off with the SR-20, Chris, walk me through really quick on a cold start and a hot start, how we do the SR-20 for the start, and then we'll talk about the ground ops, and we'll do it kind of in a question and answer session. So first off, get in the airplane, we're ready to start the motor, we go through the checklist, in the seat, ready to start. What are the procedures that we use here?
So these procedures have been developed in coordination with our director of maintenance and our maintenance team, because the IO-390 has a very advanced fuel control that has a barometrically compensated fuel control. So as you are climbing, theoretically, you wouldn't have to lean the engine during the climb as air density is decreasing. One of the things we found is that sometimes it's easy to flood this engine.
Okay.
So we have, again, working with our director of maintenance, we follow Cirrus recommendation of the definition of a cold versus hot start at 100 degrees Fahrenheit on the oil temperature. So if the oil temp is 100 or above, that would be defined as a hot start. Less than 100, that would be a cold start. I'm going to put a little asterisk. For those of you who live in the desert Southwest or sometimes here in Florida, you walk to an airplane that hasn't flown at all that day, the engine might be over 100 degrees. We would define that as first start of the day, probably follow the cold start procedure.
Agrees, yeah.
So when we think about, priming the engine, I'm going to make the assumption that the avionics are turned on and timed in. So with the Lycoming IO-390, normally Lycoming's procedure is to start this engine, prime it and then start the engine with the mixture and cutoff and moving the mixture forward as the engine is going through the start process.
That's as per the POH there, correct.
And what we have found is that we have a high percentage of flood events that have occurred. Again, we've coordinated with our director of maintenance to come up with a procedure that is really, really improving the longevity of our engines, especially with low time inexperienced pilots.
And the starters.
So procedure-wise, it's for the cold start, the first thing you'll see is it looks a lot like the SR-22. So we open the throttle full up, we go mixture full rich, and then we turn the pump on. Remember, the SR-20 doesn't have a boost and a prime position, it's just a boost position. So we turn the pump on, and our eyes are glued to the fuel flow gauge. And as soon as we see fuel flow, we count 1,000, 2, 1,000, and then we turn the pump off. One of the problems that we see a lot of times is that either a delay of moving the mixture back to cutoff, right, or through closing the throttle to a 1/4 inch. What ends up happening is this is where the engine floods. So after the engine is primed, close your throttle, reopen it a 1/4 inch. With the boost pump turned off, right, mixture still in the rich position, engage your starter for 10 seconds, or the engine is self-sustaining, whichever occurs first. And we have about a 99% success rate of this engine starting.
Good. And just to clarify, we're priming it with the boost button, and we're counting 1 potato, 2 potato, and turning the boost pump off.
After we see fuel flow.
Correct. After the fuel flow, 1 potato, 2 potato, off. That's correct. So after fuel flow, counting for 1 to 2 seconds. In the wintertime, 2 seconds. Summertime, maybe 1 second if you're really kind of cutting hairs here. Falling apart. And so that's the prime for the SR-20 IO390. Gets us to starting. And then we set 1,000 RPM, go through our after starter flow, and do the checklist, check the oil pressure, the other things to the checklist. Normal checklist after that. So that was the engine start for the SR-20. Anything else to add for the SR-20 cold start? Good?
One thing I would like to add is if your RPM is a little bit higher than you would like it, when your engines first start, I don't care if it's a 20, a 22, 22T, try to avoid rapidly ripping the throttle closed. All right? When they're short of it spinning up to some radically high RPM, if you rapidly close your throttle, even if you don't go all the way close, there's a high likelihood that the engine is going to shut down.
Okay.
It's still cold. It's still kind of getting started. You know, we don't have to immediately be at 1000 RPM. Just remember, measure with the micrometer, mark with that crown. All right, split it with your chainsaw. You know.
Good. And on our procedure, we have 1,000 to 1,200 is what we use for the RPM. That works really good. Keeps it from waiting too long there. All right, good. Really quick on the hot start on this one.
So for the SR-20, remember that this engine has a propensity for flooding when it's hot. It's already got fuel, but we are really working to get the vapor that is existing in the fuel distribution manifold that liquid has baked out and turned into vapor because of the heat rising when the airplane sits on the ground. So the first thing that we teach here at PRP is open your throttle about halfway open. We aren't measuring in inches here. Mixture in cutoff. Turn your boost pump on, and the first thing you're going to hear is you're going to kind of hear a higher pitch, and then that pitch of the boost pump is going to lower. And what that's telling you is it has now gotten rid of the vapor from where the fuel comes through the firewall to the pump, and it's now technically recirculating that fuel back to the fuel tank. And once you hear the low pitch, move your mixture towards rich, and as soon as you see fuel flow, shut your boost pump off. Now, close your mixture to cutoff. And this is where we do a more classic Lycoming start. So left hand on the key, right hand on your mixture lever, and then engage that starter for 10 seconds or the engine is self-sustaining, whichever occurs first. Remember, you might get that initial kick over where the engine starts and it's burning off the liquid that's in the very end of the injector, and then it's getting replaced with some vapor. Right? Take advantage of the 10-second engage time on your starter. All right? And then the event, usually about 7 to 8 seconds in the engage timeline, the engine fires up. It might be running a little bit rough, but it's running on its own. That's where we let go of the key. And immediately, no delay, mixture full rich.
Makes sense. And I use the term with my students is hold the key through the start. That through the start means it's fully started, because you will get the false start on many times. Hold it through that start so it actually starts, then release, then obviously the mixture can go full.
And as once you get your, again, I see a lot of times people are very slow to move that mixture to full rich and the engine dies. When the engine first fires up, all right, immediately full rich, and then smoothly transfer your hand onto the throttle and smoothly, not jerking, just reduce its sunk. The goal is to catch the prop from doing that crazy, out of control spin up you hear sometimes on the FBO ramp. Now, with the hot start, I'm perfectly happy to have the RPM 1200 RPM, the engine's running, right? And I'm just going to let it run for 3 to 5 minutes before I really worry about getting it back to 1000 RPM, because so often you rush to get to 1000 RPM and there's a little bit of vapor in the line and then your engine dies. But just in recap, the whole goal with the hot start procedure is getting rid of the vapor, replacing it with liquid, And our desire is to only use one starter engagement because so many people engage the starter for more than the limitation of 10 seconds and they just burn through starters.
That or they engage, release, and re-engage prior to it spinning down, and they can actually chew up some of the starter teeth.
Oh, yeah.
Good discussion on the start. Now we're going to walk through the flight itself really quickly. Boost pump in the SR-20 will stay off after start. Go through after start flow. We're taxiing. We do a run up. After the engine run up is when the boost pump during the checklist will come back on for the takeoff and the climb. So now that we're in the climb position with the boost pump and fuel there, let's start leaning on taxi. We do lean our aircraft on taxi here. So we pull it back to the X is kind of where we kind of pull that mixture back to where it says MIXTURE. Pull it back to the X. That works pretty good for leaning on taxi to keep from fouling the plugs. Any other techniques on that?
You know, the book, if you actually dig into the AMM, where it talks about leaning on the ground, and it's also on the IFOM, it talks about lean to where you see about a 10 to 20 RPM increase on the ground. That's about the X. For those of us who have some older aircraft with a number of times that either the linkage is getting a little bit stretched, you know, or you've had to have your linkage readjusted and recalibrated a few times, what I've noticed is a lot of times going to the X isn't quite the right place. You either shut the engine down when it's hot, or, you know, you haven't seen that RPM increase, which really says you're running too rich on the ground. So if you really are looking for it smoothly, you can't jerk the mixture, but smoothly, you know, lean to where you see a very minor RPM increase.
Okay, sounds good. That saves the plugs. All right, getting to the takeoff, getting airborne. Let's talk about in the climb.
Before we go there, just one other thing.
Right.
For the IO390 SR-20, and I'm going to contrast it. We're really not going to talk about the IO360, which is in the Gen 3 and earlier SR-20s. The IO360 POH actually allows the mixture, right, to be as required during the run-up. The IO390 requires it to be enriched. So, you know, if you've leaned on the ground before you actually do the engine run-up, just remember, select rich before you bring the RPM up to 2,200 RPM.
Good point. Boost pump off and mixture rich for the run-up, and then after the run-up, before takeoff, obviously both boost and mixture rich.
Yep.
Good. And we use the term, by the way, right before you get clearance for takeoff or after clearance for takeoff. I use final fuel, flaps, caps, and maps is what I use. I'll do the finals clear, fuel. I'll check both my boost pump is on, fullest tank, mixture's rich, flaps are at 50% for takeoff, caps pin is removed, and my maps is zoomed out for the tower ops. That's what we teach here at PRP. Final fuel, flaps, caps, and maps. Now we're on the runway. We take off. After the takeoff in the climb, talk a little bit about leaning in the climb.
So the IO390, again, it has an altitude compensated fuel control. So if you're operating at altitudes, my experience says about 5,000 feet MSL, you typically are just full rich all the way in the climb.
Good.
Now, one of the challenges with the IO390 and actually the SR-20, you know, they aren't the highest climbers, i.e. they don't climb as fast as the SR-22. So here at PRP Aviation, we actually teach to climb at VY until we get to 1,000 feet AGL. Our premise and our goal is to, in a timely fashion, get at or above caps available altitudes. And once we reach 1,000 feet AGL, that's where it's time now to prioritize best climb rate versus I need to bring into my cross-check managing the temperatures of my CHTs.
Okay.
Obviously, with an air-cooled engine, we can either manage it by more fuel in the engine or more airflow going through the cowling. So we're already full rich, so now our requirement to cool these engines is more air. So we typically climb somewhere between 105 and 110 knots indicated airspeed as a good balance between climb rate, IFR climb requirements, and cooling of the engine. And we'll normally climb at 105 unless we start seeing the CHTs getting somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 degrees, and then that's when we'll select 110 knots. Remember, the limits for CHT where they go caution are different in the IO390 than they are in the Continental equipped aircraft.
Right. Light coming versus Continental.
Yeah, the light coming caution is at 435. So especially during the summertime, air conditioning on, you're probably going to see CHTs somewhere right around 400, maybe even a little bit north of 400. And again, we try to head that off by selecting 110 knots during the climb if we see the CHTs getting close to 400 degrees.
Agreed. Yep, good. All right, once we get up to altitude and leveling off.
But one last part about the climb. Technically, the climb is lean as required per Garmin Perspective Plus. Remember, Garmin Perspective Plus is giving us indications of the proper fuel flow based on the density altitude. Operations below about 5,000 feet MSL, it's typically the white fuel flow is right there at the top of the green band.
Right.
Above about 5,000 feet, you start seeing the green band decreasing.
Sure.
So about every 1,000 feet, check where the green band is, and then small leaning to place your actual fuel flow, the white target, on the top of the green band.
Good. Makes sense. Awesome. That's it for the climb?
That's it for the climb.
Awesome. To the level off now, I'll talk about boost pump and lean procedures or best power procedures.
So the IO390 is certified for best power and best economy. Best power is defined as 100 degrees rich of peak at power settings, and it gets a little bit different than the Continentals, but it's 100 degrees rich of peak.
Okay.
Best economy, it has a range, and that's peak power, or it's peak to minus 50 degrees lean of peak.
Okay.
Here at PRP, we actually advocate as a balance of fuel flow, cruise, time, value of money, and essentially we're cruising at 75% power, and Garmin Perspective Plus has a target, a blue cyan target, and it kind of tells you lean right to the blue cyan target. Well, if you pull up the engine analyzer, you're going to find that it's somewhere kind of in between, and based on recommendations from Cirrus and Lycoming, this is where they are advocating that we operate the aircraft. And it's going to give you about 13 gallons per hour, and it's going to give you a relatively decent true airspeed, so around 135-ish knots, depending upon the outside air temperature. But leading it is almost as easy as managing the SR-22T with the advances of technology that we see in Garmin Perspective Plus.
Good. So again, lean to the cyan is a big thing. And then above or below 6,500 feet, did you talk about the differences?
I didn't. So typically we're cruising in the 20, a little bit lower altitude. But if my chosen altitude is at or below 6,500, then we're setting 75% and leaning.
Okay.
As you get above 6,500 feet MSL, a lot of times it's really hard to get to 75% power. You might be wide open throttle and not even getting 75% with a normally aspirated engine. So here at that initial throttle reduction, we set 2,500 RPM, and then we lean to the cyan target.
Okay.
The last thing I want to discuss is the fuel boost pump. Cirrus recommends that the fuel boost pump stay on for 30 minutes after reaching cruise to allow the fuel to cool, all right, or during any maneuvering flight, as a note in the POH. Here at PRP, we actually will teach, when you think about the cost of the boost pump, and sometimes there's maintenance failures on the boost pump and it's no fun being stranded. So the care and feeding of getting the best out of the boost pump, when we make that initial throttle reduction as we're starting the leaning process, we'll actually turn the boost pump off and ask ourselves, is the engine running smooth or not? The engine is running smooth, the fuel is cool enough, there's no vaporization, all right, lean as we've discussed. If the engine at all has any hiccups or chugs, just turn the boost pump on, because your airplane is telling you that the fuel is of a temperature such that it's starting to vaporize. Remember, our fuel boost pump is for two purposes. The first purpose is to prime the engine. The second purpose is vapor suppression. So hence, takeoff, climb. When we're in the approach phase, just in case we have to do a go-around, we have the boost pump on because we don't want the engine to hiccup.
Good. Makes sense. Really quick, talk about if I leaned up at, let's say I'm leaned at 7,000 feet and I want to climb to 9,000 feet. I'm in this leaned condition. Take me from 7,000 to 9,000 feet really quick on boost pump, mixture, etc. Really quick.
So again, we're going back to a climb phase, so the boost pump needs to come on.
Pretty good.
Secondly, as we increase power in the Cirrus, all right, we need to lead with the mixture lever.
Okay, good.
So because we've leaned, all right, I don't go full rich because I have seen the engine chug a little bit.
Okay.
But I enrichen, and then we go back to the climb power, which is wide open throttle.
Okay.
And then I take a look at the green fuel flow target, and I lean to put the fuel flow on the top of the green band.
Very good. Okay. Yep. Great. A good order of events there. And once we level off again, lean it as we just talked about previously. Good. Now we're in the descent phase, getting ready to calculate our descent. We start down. When would you turn the boost pump back on?
So my technique is really predicated on flying the normally aspirated SR-22 because that's what I have the majority of my time in because that was the first SR that I purchased. I normally turn my boost pump back on when I get about 2,000 feet below my cruise altitude.
Okay.
And one, I did that so I didn't forget to have it on if I needed it for a go-around.
Right.
Two, it was just a little bit extra fuel flow that kept my engine smooth all the way down to pattern altitude because we want to keep the engine leaned all the way down, during the descent. We are advocates of power on descents here at PRP Aviation. It's predicated upon smooth air because our airplanes are going to get going really fast. We're going to be somewhere right around V normal. It's not, right there at the top or the bottom of the yellow band. Keeps the engines nice and warm. You don't worry about cold air, and we can have conversations all day long of whether damage is done to the engine with a cold shock or not. But the important thing is it gets us where we want to go faster.
Right. Always good.
So again, that little extra fuel kept the engine nice and smooth when I was about 2,000 feet below my cruise altitude. In the case of the SR-20, my habit patterns are pretty well established.
Sure.
So when I get about 2,000 feet below my cruise altitude during the descent, doing a power on descent, my boost pump comes back.
Very good. I've done the same thing on my cross countries, and I felt it's the same. SR-20 works like a champ on both platforms. All right, now we're down to the airport environment, if you will, instrument approach, if you will, and getting close to the landing. When did you now go back to mixture rich and do those landing checks? How early would you do those? What's your technique for that?
So I keep the engine leaned until pattern altitude, or I level off at the final approach fixed altitude in the case of having to shoot an instrument approach procedure.
Pretty good.
Now, during the descent, I'm going to be throttle reducing to make sure that I stay at the published limit, for whatever cruise power I'm choosing to fly. In the case of the SR-20, I'm keeping it at 75% power unless I have a turbulence environment issue I need to worry about, or I'm just not comfortable flying that fast. So I keep it lean until I level off at pattern altitude or the final approach fixed altitude. When I level off, I set a known power for the airspeed target. So in the case of the SR-22, I'm setting 15.
SR-20.
I'm sorry.
It's all good.
The SR-20, I'm setting 50 to 55% power, and then I immediately go mixture rich at that point so I don't forget it.
Very good. Yeah. So I wrote an instrument paper that's also on our website you can look at, but I think the phrase I used was the first level off below 3,000 feet is kind of when I do those kind of landing checks just so you don't forget it. That's about the time you get in that environment where you have to set a known power setting. In our case, 50% for the SR-20, and mixture rich, boost pump on, ready for landing. Great. Get to the landing, and after we clear the runway, boost pump comes off. Mixture could go back to the X again, or as the RPM increases a little bit, wherever your taxiback checklist taxiback procedures are, and then back in the chocks for shutdown. Anything else on the SR-20 for leaning, boost pump procedures, and mixture techniques?
I would just caution, don't be so perfect that you start leaning your engine on the ground while you're on the runway.
Sure, absolutely not.
Remember, your engine is still hot. Airflow is decreasing through the cowling. So you could be dealing with some fuel vaporization issues beginning. Maybe yours truly might have accidentally shut an engine down while coasting down a runway one time because I tried to lean it too quickly.
All right.
So my technique is I don't think about leaning after landing until I am off the runway on a taxiway, and essentially I basically at the tail end of my after landing flow.
Very good. Yeah, great caveat on that. Awesome. That's it for the SR-20. Got through that one in about 25 minutes, I think. We'll see if we can get through the SR-22 now.